The morning my son-in-law, Graham Alderton, finally understood what kind of woman he had been dismissing for 11 years, I was sitting at the head of a boardroom table in downtown Vancouver, reviewing a catering contract worth more money than he had ever handed me for groceries. He was sitting across from me. He had come to beg. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning is important. The beginning is where it all started to break, so slowly I didn't notice until the cracks had spread through everything. 32 years ago, when my husband Leonard and I first moved to Kelowna, we had almost nothing except each other and a second-hand van that smelled permanently of someone else's dog. Leonard was a carpenter, good with his hands, gentle with people, the kind of man who fixed things quietly without needing praise for it. We built our life slowly, carefully, the way you build anything that lasts. I cooked, I cleaned. I raised our daughter Teresa through ear infections and algebra homework, and every painful phase of adolescence. And on weekends, when Leonard had extra contracts, I drove estimates to clients, answered phone calls, balanced the books from our kitchen table while soup simmered on the stove. That was our life. Simple, honest, enough. Leonard passed away when Teresa was 26. A heart attack, unexpected, the kind that leaves no time for goodbyes. I don't talk about that period easily, even now. Grief at 60 does something different to you than grief at 40. At 40, you still believe recovery means returning to what you had before. At 60, you understand recovery means learning to live as a different version of yourself than you planned. What I remember most from those first years alone is how much I cooked. Cooking had always been how I loved people. Casseroles brought to neighbors. Birthday cakes assembled with embarrassing ambition. Sunday roasts that kept Teresa coming home long after she technically should have started cooking for herself. Food was language in our house. It was how I said, I see you and you matter, and I am still here. When Teresa met Graham Alderton, I tried very hard to love him the way she did. Graham was the kind of man who filled rooms without noticing he was doing it. Broad shoulders, confident voice, the sort of easy authority that comes from a lifetime of being taken seriously without earning it. He worked in commercial real estate, which in Kelowna meant he spent a lot of time driving expensive cars and describing himself as an entrepreneur. He was not unkind exactly. He simply operated under the assumption that the women around him existed primarily to support whatever he was currently focused on. Teresa adored him. That was the part I had to accept. In the early years of their marriage, I visited often. I helped with their first apartment, helped again when they moved to a larger house in West Kelowna. I assembled furniture and organized kitchens and babysat their son Emmett through the toddler years, while Teresa worked part-time and Graham worked, in his words, constantly. I never complained. I was grateful to be needed. But gratitude, I would eventually learn, can become its own kind of trap. The comment started small, the way small things always do. At Emmett's 4th birthday party, I brought homemade lemon cake and 3 trays of finger sandwiches. Graham stood in the backyard with his golf friends while I set everything out, poured drinks, cut cake, organized party bags, and cleaned up afterward. When someone complimented the food, Graham laughed warmly. "That's just Lorraine doing her thing," he said. Just. That word sat in my chest like a stone. At Christmas dinner 2 years later, one of Graham's colleagues asked what I did, the way people ask when they want to categorize you. Before I could answer, Graham said cheerfully, "She keeps us fed and the house running, basically our secret weapon." His friends laughed. I smiled. I was 58 years old and had just been described like a household appliance. The worst moment came on a Tuesday evening in February. I had driven 40 minutes in the snow to bring Teresa soup because she was sick and Graham had a dinner he couldn't cancel. When I arrived, Graham's business partner was leaving. Graham introduced me at the door with a casual wave. "This is Teresa's mum. She's great in the kitchen. Not my name, not Lorraine, just Teresa's mum. Great in the kitchen." I drove home through the dark and the snow, and I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I stopped. Not because it didn't hurt, but because some feelings you process alone when nobody around you has any idea they caused them. That night, alone in my small house on the edge of town, I started thinking about something I had been circling for years without letting myself land on it. I was a good cook. Not good, in the modest way women my age were trained to describe themselves. I was genuinely talented, technically skilled, and I understood food the way some people understand music, intuitively and completely. I had spent 5 decades feeding people and making them feel cared for. I had run the hospitality for Leonard's company events, organized church suppers for 200 people, catered my nephew's wedding on a shoestring, and received more compliments than the florist. And I had never once thought of it as something that could belong to me professionally. I had always thought of it as something I did for other people. I was 61 years old, and sitting in my kitchen in the dark, I started wondering what might happen if I did it for myself. I did not tell Graham first. I should clarify that. I told Teresa one afternoon when Graham was away for a conference and Emmett was at school. We sat in her kitchen with tea, and I said it carefully. "I'm thinking about starting a small catering business." Teresa's face did something complicated. She smiled immediately, the automatic smile of a supportive daughter. Then she paused. "Oh, Mom, that's a big step. I know. You're not exactly at the age where you want to take on that kind of stress." That sentence landed somewhere uncomfortable, not because she intended cruelty, but because she had absorbed, without realizing it, the assumption that my age was a ceiling rather than simply a number. "What age would be right for it?" I asked. She looked slightly flustered. "I just mean, running a business is complicated. There's taxes, suppliers, clients." She sounded like she was warning me about traffic. "Graham could probably tell you how hard it is." And there it was. Even in her support, the first instinct was to redirect me toward her husband's authority. I did not bring it up again for 3 weeks. Then one Sunday at their house, Graham was talking about a property deal over dinner. Something had fallen through. He was irritated, a little too loud about it, filling the room with his frustration the way he always did. When there was a pause, I set down my fork and said, quietly, "I've been looking into starting a catering company. Small, local events to begin with." Graham looked at me the way adults sometimes look at children who have said something ambitious and slightly adorable. "Catering." He repeated it like he was confirming he'd heard correctly. "Yes." He picked up his wine glass. "Mum, do you have any idea how many catering businesses fail in the first 2 years? I've been reading about it. It's brutal. Margins are terrible. You're competing against people who have been doing this for 20 years with full commercial kitchens and staff." He shook his head with the measured patience of a man explaining something very basic to someone very slow. "It's not like having people over for dinner." "I know that. I just don't want to see you lose your savings chasing something that sounds fun, but isn't realistic." Realistic. Such a useful word for dismissing people. Teresa watched me carefully across the table. She didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer. Graham topped up his own wine and added, almost kindly, "You should enjoy your retirement, Lorraine. Travel. Take a cooking class if you want to do something with food. But starting a business at your age, it's a lot of risk for very little reward." I nodded. I thanked him for his perspective. Then I went home and registered Whitmore Kitchen Co. That same night, I used my maiden name, Whitmore. The name I was born with, the name I had carried for 60 years before quietly setting it aside when I married. It felt right to bring it back for this. The first months were humbling in ways I had not fully prepared for. I applied for a commercial kitchen rental in Kelowna, a shared facility used by several small food businesses. The woman who ran it, Sandra Park, looked me over with professional neutrality and said the waiting list was 3 months long. I went home and called every commercial kitchen in the Okanagan Valley until I found one with availability. Then I went through food safety certification again, though I had held one from an old church kitchen roll years prior. Then I built a website, which took me 2 weekends and several phone calls to my nephew before it looked like something a real business might own. I made a list of every community event within 50 kilometers and contacted every organizer I could find. Most did not reply. Several replied to say they had existing catering arrangements. One replied to ask what my pricing was, then never followed up. For 6 weeks, I worked alone in that rented kitchen preparing sample menus and testing recipes for imaginary clients. Some evenings I drove home smelling of roasted garlic and felt slightly ridiculous. Then I remembered Graham's voice saying not realistic and kept going. The first real inquiry came from a woman named June Ferris. She was organizing her mother's 90th birthday celebration. 40 guests, afternoon tea format, modest budget. I'm going to be honest, June said over the phone. We can't afford the quotes we've been getting. Tell me what you can afford, I said. She told me. It was genuinely tight, but I understood tight budgets and how much a family gathering could mean, so I said yes. We spent 2 weeks going back and forth over menus, substitutions, presentation details. June was thoughtful and specific, and I liked her immediately. The afternoon of the party, I arrived at the community hall 2 hours early. Set up alone. Arranged 3 tiers of finger sandwiches, scones with cream and jam, miniature lemon tarts, shortbread, a birthday cake with 90 white candles. By the time guests arrived, the room smelled like a proper celebration. June's mother, a tiny woman named Estelle who wore a pink cardigan and pearl earrings, took one look at the table and burst into tears. The good kind. This is exactly what I wanted, she said, and squeezed both my hands. June called me the following week. Everyone kept asking who catered it. I gave out your card to 8 people. 8. That number felt enormous. Within 3 months, those 8 referrals had turned into 4 bookings. Small events, community dinners, a retirement party, a shower, nothing dramatic. But people started knowing my name, not as Teresa's mom, not as Leonard's widow, as Whitmore Kitchen Co., as Lorraine. Graham found out I had actually launched the business when Teresa mentioned it at Easter dinner. He looked surprised in the way people look when a small joke continues longer than expected. You actually registered it? Last autumn, he processed this. Any bookings? I told him about the events so far. His expression settled into something I recognized. Managed encouragement. The kind you offer someone who has taken up watercolor painting and has more enthusiasm than talent. Well, good for you, he said. Keep it manageable, though. Don't overextend. I smiled. Teresa watched him, and then looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes she didn't quite say out loud. By my second year, Whitmore Kitchen Co. had outgrown the shared kitchen rental. I signed a lease on a small commercial kitchen space in the Rutland area, hired a part-time assistant named Beth, and started responding to inquiries for larger events. Corporate lunches, fundraising dinners, a wedding reception for 80 in Summerland. The wedding was the turning point. The couple, a pair of teachers from Penticton, had a budget that most Kelowna caterers would have laughed at. I did not laugh. I redesigned their menu around seasonal ingredients from a farm I had started working with, kept labor costs manageable by simplifying the service style, and delivered a dinner that one guest told me afterward was the best wedding food she had eaten in 20 years. That guest was Harriet Ng, who turned out to be the events director for a mid-sized technology company in Kelowna, with an annual client appreciation dinner that had previously been held at a hotel. She called me in September. Could you handle 60 people? Plated dinner? 4 courses? I paused just long enough to feel the weight of it. Then I said, yes. That dinner became a reference I used for every subsequent proposal. Harriet referred me to 2 more companies. Those companies referred me forward again. Whitmore Kitchen Co. had become, without any grand announcement, genuinely profitable. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the opposite direction. Graham's company was struggling. It started with small signs, fewer mentions of deals closing, more evenings where he came to dinner tightly wound, the tension sitting visibly in his jaw. Teresa mentioned carefully that some investments had not performed the way he expected. Real estate in certain parts of the interior had been slower than projected. He had borrowed against future returns that were arriving later than planned. I noticed and said nothing. That was still my instinct then. Notice and say nothing. One evening, that autumn, I was at their house helping Emmett with a school project about local businesses when Graham came home early from a meeting. He poured himself a scotch before he even set down his briefcase. That was new. He didn't speak to me directly. He moved through the kitchen like I wasn't there, which was familiar enough that I barely noticed it myself. Then he said to Teresa, loudly enough that I could hear, I might need to borrow against the RRSP temporarily. Teresa went very still. I kept my eyes on Emmett's project. Later, when Graham had gone upstairs, Teresa sat down at the table across from me and exhaled slowly. He's worried, she said. I noticed. She looked at her hands. Things are tighter than he expected. I nodded. There was a long pause. Your business is doing well, Teresa said. It wasn't quite a question. It is, I said carefully. She nodded several times. Then she reached over and squeezed my hand and didn't say anything else. But something in that silence felt like the beginning of her finally seeing me as something other than her mother who was good in the kitchen. The incident that changed everything happened at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital foundation in Kelowna. Whitmore Kitchen had been hired to manage the catering for 300 guests, the largest contract I had taken on to date. I had spent 2 months preparing. Beth and I had brought on 2 additional staff for the evening. The menu had been tested 3 times. I arrived at the venue at noon. Graham arrived at 7 as a guest. I did not know he would be there. When I saw him across the ballroom, speaking to a developer I recognized from Teresa's descriptions, something in me went privately still. I was wearing a white chef's coat. I had a clipboard. I was running the floor. He did not see me at first. Later, during the cocktail hour, I came out from the kitchen to check the appetizer stations. Graham was standing nearby with a small group of people I did not recognize. One of them, a woman in a red dress, was holding a small puff pastry and saying something complimentary about the food. Graham turned to look for the source, and our eyes met. The pause lasted about 2 seconds. Then he recovered. He said smoothly, "Oh, this is my mother-in-law, Lorraine. She does some catering." He gestured vaguely in my direction. Some catering. The woman in the red dress turned to me with genuine interest. "This food is extraordinary. Are you the chef?" "I'm the owner," I said. "Whitmore Kitchen Co." She looked surprised in the pleasant way, not the condescending way. "This is your company? I've been hearing about you. Patricia Delacroix, from the event planning firm downtown." She pulled out a card. "We've been looking for a catering partner for a series of corporate events next year. Would you be open to a meeting?" I took her card. I said of course. Graham did not say anything. Not in congratulations, not in curiosity. He simply turned back to his own conversation. Patricia Delacroix's firm handled events across the Okanagan and into Vancouver. The corporate partnership she was describing was the largest opportunity Whitmore Kitchen Co. had been offered. We met 3 times over the following month. Patricia was direct, organized, and extremely good at her job. She told me at our second meeting that she had checked my references and spoken to Harriet Ng. "Harriet said you're the most reliable caterer she's worked with in 10 years, Patricia said. "She specifically mentioned that you never over-communicate anxiety. You just solve problems." I thought about that for a moment. "I've had a lot of practice staying calm when things go wrong," I said. Patricia smiled slightly. "I imagine you have." The partnership was formalized in March. Graham found out in April, when Teresa told him during a Sunday dinner. His fork paused for a moment. "That's the Delacroix firm?" he said. "Delacroix the way people say the name of somewhere they've tried to get into and couldn't." "Yes," Teresa said. She was watching him carefully. Graham set his fork down. "How did that happen?" I explained, briefly, the gala and Patricia and the meetings. The more I talked, the quieter Graham became. Not quiet in the warm way, quiet in the recalculating way. Finally, he said, "You should be careful not to grow too fast. Businesses lose control when they scale without the right infrastructure." Teresa set her water glass down with slightly more force than the situation required. I looked at Graham for a moment. "I have Beth full-time now, 2 contractors on retainer, a commercial lease, a bookkeeper, and a signed agreement with a firm that handles regional corporate events." I paused. "I think the infrastructure is there." Something crossed his face that I had not seen there before. Not anger exactly. Something more uncomfortable than that. Recognition. The real trouble came that summer. Graham's business, which he had been describing for 2 years as navigating temporary market headwinds, was in more serious difficulty than either Teresa or I had understood. I found out the way I found out most important things in that family. Indirectly, late. Teresa called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice flat in the way it goes when she is working very hard to sound controlled. "Graham needs to talk to you," she said. "Can you come over Thursday?" I said yes. I did not ask why. Some conversations need to happen in person. Thursday was overcast, the kind of gray Kelowna afternoon in August that surprises visitors who expect perpetual sunshine. Teresa made tea she barely touched. Graham sat at the kitchen table with the posture of a man who had recently had to relearn the dimensions of a chair. He explained the situation methodically. A commercial development project in Vernon that had stalled. a financing arrangement that required renewal, a gap he was trying to bridge until certain payments arrived. Then he said the thing he had come to say. I was wondering if you might consider a short-term investment, or a loan. He paused. To the business. Just to cover the next 3 months. The kitchen was very quiet. I looked at Graham carefully. Then I looked at my daughter, who was looking at the table. How much? I asked. He named a figure. It was significant. It was in fact nearly the amount I had reinvested into Whitmore Kitchen Co. over the past 2 years to fund its growth. I thought about the evenings he had called my business not realistic. I thought about your age and too much risk and just some catering. I thought about all the Sunday dinners where I had been invisible in that kitchen. I did not feel angry, exactly. I felt something more complicated than that. A kind of grief for all the years he had looked past me, combined with a strange, very quiet clarity. Graham, I said slowly, I want to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer. He nodded. When I told you I was starting this business, what did you actually think? He looked uncomfortable. I was concerned. What did you actually think? I asked again gently. A long pause. I thought it wouldn't go anywhere, I nodded. And now you're asking to borrow money from it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard in years. Teresa looked up from the table and met my eyes, and something in her expression was raw in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. I did not say yes. I also did not say no, not yet. I told Graham I needed a few days to think. I asked him to send me a summary of the financial situation and what exactly the funds would be used for. He seemed slightly surprised that I asked for documentation. That, more than anything, told me how he had always thought of my money. As something available, not something earned. When I left their house that afternoon, I drove down by the lake and parked for a while. The water was still and the mountains were beginning to lose their snow early from the summer heat. I thought about Leonard, who would have known exactly what to say. I thought about my mother, who ran a bed and breakfast in Nova Scotia for 40 years, and was never once described as a businesswoman by anyone who met her socially. I thought about all the women I knew who had spent their lives cooking, and organizing and managing and problem-solving, under every possible label except the accurate one. Then I drove home and called my accountant. The conditions I eventually offered Graham were not punitive. I want to be clear about that. I had no interest in revenge. Revenge requires you to stay emotionally tethered to someone, and I was done being tethered to Graham's opinion of me in any direction. What I offered was simply honest. I would provide a loan structured formally with a written agreement, a repayment timeline, and standard interest. All terms would be reviewed by both our lawyers. There would be no informality, no assumptions, no handshake arrangements that could later be reinterpreted, according to whoever needed them, to mean something different. Graham's first response, delivered through Teresa, was that it seemed like a lot of formality for a family situation. I said kindly that the formality was exactly the point. He agreed, eventually. I think the agreement itself, sitting across the table signing paperwork with me on one side and his lawyer on the other, was genuinely one of the more disorienting experiences of his life. Because, for the first time, I was not the woman in the background. I was the person holding the terms. What I did not expect was Teresa. She came to my house alone one evening in September, while this was all being finalized. She brought wine she didn't open and sat at my kitchen table and looked around at the room where I had spent so many years feeding everyone else's life before my own. I owe you an apology, she said. I started to say she didn't, the automatic response women like me have been trained to offer. She stopped me. No, let me say it. She folded her hands on the table. I told you to be careful. I suggested you talk to Graham before you moved forward, as though he was the authority on what was possible for you. She shook her head, slowly. I was so used to seeing you as my mum who takes care of things that I completely missed that you were also a person with your own capabilities, who didn't need anyone's permission. My throat tightened in a way I hadn't expected. You would have done it with or without any of us, Teresa said quietly. I would have, I agreed. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and we sat there for a while without saying anything, which was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Whitmore Kitchen Co. now operates out of a full commercial kitchen in Kelowna, with a team of 7. We handle corporate events, private celebrations, nonprofit fundraisers, and a weekly meal preparation service. I added for seniors after an older client mentioned she hadn't had a proper home-cooked meal since her husband's passed. That last one is not our most profitable service. It is my favorite. Patricia Delacroix called me last spring to say that a Vancouver hotel group had asked about our availability for a series of regional conference events. She said it casually, as though it were simply the next logical step, which I suppose by then it was. I sat very still in my office for a moment after that call ended. My office. A real one, with my name on the door. Lorraine Whitmore, founder. Graham repaid the loan 17 months after he signed the agreement. He was 3 weeks early, which surprised me. When he dropped off the final payment documentation at Teresa's house, where I happened to be visiting, he handed me the envelope and said, "Everything's in order." Then he paused. "You should know your terms were fairer than I deserved." It was not an apology exactly, but it was closer to honesty than anything he had said to me in 11 years. I thanked him for saying it. I meant it. Emmett is 12 now. He came with Teresa to the kitchen one Saturday this spring to help pack orders for the senior service. He carried boxes without being asked, chatted cheerfully with Beth, and at one point looked around the kitchen with all the easy curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to underestimate people, and said, "Gran, do you like doing this?" I thought about the kitchen table in my old house, the late nights with the laptop, the first inquiry from June Ferris, Sandra Park's waiting list, and the commercial kitchen in Rutland that smelled like steel and possibility. "More than almost anything," I told him. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to carrying boxes. There is something I want to say to anyone watching this who has spent years wondering if the windows has closed on them. Years feeling useful only in the ways other people needed from you. Years shrinking the size of your own ambitions to fit inside someone else's comfort. The window does not close. It does not close at 55 or 61 or at any age anyone has ever made you feel it should. What closes is your willingness to keep waiting for permission. And the moment that closes, something else opens. Something that was yours all along. I know where you're watching from tonight, or I'd like to. Tell me in the comments, and tell me what time it is there. If this story reached you at the end of a long day, I hope it reached you at the right moment. And if you've ever been told your dream isn't realistic, I hope you remember Lorraine Whitmore, who started at 61 in a rented kitchen in Kelowna, and built something nobody saw coming except her.